Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to a Friday the 13th episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Mike Farah, and today we have Dillon Gilbertson on the program. He is an indie writer. You may know him from a previous series called Sweetheart. He is now kickstarting the second issue of his supernatural new series called My Neighbor Necromancer. So go to Kickstarter, check that out. We get into everything about Dillon, how he sort of came up into comics, what he's working on, what his interests are. Hint, hint, it's horror and supernatural stuff, hence the Friday the 13th publish date. So let's get into it. This is Dillon Gilbertson. Dillon, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited that you had me on the show. I started listening a little while ago and was an immediate fan, so I couldn't be happier that you guys agreed to have me on. Thank you.
Flattery will get you everywhere.
Yeah.
So thanks for being on the show. And we're going to kick you off with our usual first question, which is how did you first discover comics?
Um, I that's a question that I think about occasionally, and sometimes I dig up different answers, oddly enough, because I think there are a lot of things that came around about the same time. And I want to say my first introduction into comics was a video game on Sega Genesis called Comic Zone. And from what I recall, it was like a comic artist gets sucked into his own creation. And so you're a character, it's a side-scrolling kind of a beat 'em up game, and you have to like jump between panels and navigate your way through the world that your character himself has drawn. Um, and I think that was like my first real like interaction with comics. And then I think very shortly after I discovered the Calvin and Hobbes books. It was the collected editions I was mostly a fan of. There was one called the Attack of the Abominable Snow Goons, I think it was called. But like Calvin Hobbes is sort of one of those touchstone comics that sort of works for every age. And when I was younger, I appreciated it just because Calvin was a scamp and liked to pull tricks on his dad and stuff. And then as I grew older, and then I would revisit those comics time and time again, I would start to discover new things about it. Or like I would start to appreciate new jokes and new aspects of it, and that sort of became sort of my comfort food of comics, and that's sort of something that I like to keep close are those comics. And then my first, I think, actual proper floppy comic was an issue of X-Men, and it was on a grocery store shelf. I can see the cover in my mind, but I couldn't honestly tell you what the issue was. I knew Once Upon a Time, but I can't remember. And so I think my introduction to comics is sort of multifaceted. And then, you know, the rest I suppose is history. And I started writing off and on through middle school and high school. And I didn't really properly get into writing my own full length stories until probably late into college.
And those early books, so the Calvin and Hobbes, was that a collection or was that while it was still in the paper?
Yeah, I don't know that I ever actually experienced them in the wild, in the paper. There
Mhm.
was actually, now that you mention it, there was a time in high school where I did read a lot of the newspaper comics, um, things like Foxtrot and stuff like that. But I think that was well past Calvin and Hobbes days in the actual newspaper. I can't remember when it ended. That's a David Pepos question. I'm sure he knows that off the top of his head. But but yeah, no, they were collected editions. I had I suppose they would be graphic novels at this point. They'd be, yeah, the thick ones. I had
Right.
the stacks of those in my room.
Yeah. I ask because it's always interesting to hear those who have started out in sort of comic strips and then sort of discovered secondarily the comic book, sort of the serialized, full story kind of books. But it sounds like because yours was in a collection, it wasn't really a leap from, oh, this is a comic strip. This is different than what you eventually discovered in terms of comic books like the X-Men and what have you. I mean, obviously it's different in terms of subject matter, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
could imagine.
format wise.
I've never thought about that before. That's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, people who their intro was just like the 3, 4 panel
Right.
newspaper strips, and then they get their hands on an actual comic book or a graphic novel, and they're like, this is like 40 newspapers in one. It's amazing. Yeah, no, yeah, that's I never thought about that. But yeah, no, my introduction was straight to the big stuff.
So you have a new Kickstarter that we are going to get into later called My Neighbor Necromancer. It's actually a Kickstarter for the second issue. But before we do that, as I said, let's rewind to the beginning after you had discovered comic books and where was when did it sort of enter your head that you wanted to actually make comic books and do it, if not professionally, but as a strong side gig.
Yeah, there in middle school, before I tried my hand at writing, I tried my hand at plagiarism, I suppose you could say. I would trace the Calvin and Hobbes books and like try I would first try and recreate it by hand just by looking at it. And when it looked terrible, I would just try and make myself feel better by tracing it. Like the Spaceman Spiff ones when he's got that sweet black domino mask on and he's flying around in his spaceship. Um, and then I tried my hand a few times to draw the comics and I just couldn't grasp it. I was just so bad at it, and I didn't have the gumption to stick with it and try and develop a skill for drawing. And so I abandoned it in middle school, and then I became an avid reader in high school and through college, and thought I was reading comics left and right. I was tearing through piles of the dollar bins, and and then eventually it was in a biology class in college where we were learning about genetics and how similar human DNA was to chimpanzee DNA. And the way our professor had sort of framed it is that there were only these very few, very minor differences. And in my head, I was like, there's got to be some chance that those just accidentally get swapped, right? Like there's like if there's just a couple letters that are switched around in the DNA, like surely those could get mixed up by accident. And so I thought of this.
Sounds reasonable to me.
Yeah, that's right. It seems totally reasonable. People make mistakes all the time, God included. And so um, I had this idea for a regular human man who was born from chimps, but he was just born a man because he was a mutant. He was a mutant chimp, but was just your most average Joe. And it would have been the most boring comic of all time, and or maybe the most hilarious one of all time. I have no idea, but that sort of I had so much fun just thinking about it that all of my classes sort of became back doors to weird stories that I could build with them that were scientifically corrupt and very wrong, but from a story perspective, very entertaining, and I thought were really funny and fun. And so the first proper comic that I wrote was this terrible strip, this web strip called Bear Arm Baby. And Bear Arm Baby it was again, the idea came, and I think in a genetics class, where a fetus there was something wrong with the fetus where it was going to be born with no arms. I want to put put the word wrong in quotes there, right? But the fetus was going to be born with no arms. The mom was distraught. She said, "Is there anything you can do?" And he's like, "Well, we've been experimenting with stem cells and with ways that we can grow the arms manually within the womb." And they're like, "Yes, please, let's do it." And so he asked this unpaid intern to go and find the baby DNA. I say in quotes, that was the joke. Like, yeah, go grab me the baby DNA. And he's like, "Sure thing, boss." and he goes to grab it, and he gets there and he can't quite remember what the doctor said. He was like, was it Bay? Is Bay something? Bayer was bear? And so he grabs a vial of bear DNA, and then they put it in
As
the,
one does.
yeah, and so the baby ends up uh so while they're in the womb doing the surgery, the doctor also spills a pocket full of scalpels into the womb and then sews the whole thing up, says, "Yep, we're done," and doesn't realize they all fell in there. Also, a laser pointer also fell in there. And so when the baby is born, it's not really born so much as it rips out of the mother's womb. And it's got these massive bear arms. Like the arms are bigger than the baby itself, so it walks around on its arms. And its claws are these steel razor scalpels, and it has a laser pointer as an eye, so it's just lasers around just for effect. And that thus was born the first strip of bear arm baby. I think it lasted like 10 posts on this website, but I looked at it, I think, a year ago and was just so appalled that I kind of want to do it again. It's either the worst thing or the best thing ever. I can't really decide. It's so bad it's good, I think, kind of a deal. So
Maybe it's
that was my first comic, is I guess the answer to the question.
um so when you first said it, even though I had read some about your bibliography, I was thinking BARE, bear arm baby, and I'm
Yeah,
like, well,
like
most
you
of
have
their arms are pretty bare.
yeah. Yeah, that
Unless they're
belong
wearing
that
some fancy gloves.
yeah, that belongs more in the humanity, the human born to chimps type of
Right,
comic, where it is a
exactly,
bare arm baby,
exactly.
like, well, all most babies are bare arms. Like, well,
Sure.
that's yeah, that's his sort of his sidekick is the bare arm baby, but it's just a regular baby.
Now, had you abandoned yet your artistic endeavors by that point, or were you drawing that first strip?
No. So that was drawn by a very good friend of mine. Her name is Amber DePero. She was also sort of an amateur artist that never quite gave up, and I feel comfortable saying this because I'm so close with Amber and we talk about it all the time, but you would guess by how terrible the drawings are in Bear Arm Baby that I might have drawn them with having no skill whatsoever. But that is part of the charm of Bear Arm Baby, I think, is just how poorly it's drawn. And she agrees. She's like, this would not be funny if it was drawn well. And that's so it needed to have happened this way. I have some of her other art that she drew later on, and she improved a lot. She's a pretty talented artist these days. But yeah, no, I did not draw those or letter them. I think she did all the art and the letters for them.
Now, do you think if you do resurrect the idea, could she get back to that place of, you know,
I think
rough and tumble?
I might have talked to her about that like 5 or 6 years ago, just jokingly. She was way too busy at the time and couldn't. But I think if I ever did, it would have to be. It would have to be her that drew it.
So this was your first published, material
Mhm.
in the comic book world. Where did you go from there? I mean, so you got the appetite for this, right? You started doing it, you liked it. Maybe it didn't last as long as you wanted, but I'm sure you were developing all these other ideas. How did you sort of, grab the momentum and continue on with whatever the next projects were, the short stories, things of that nature?
Yeah, the next thing I did, I think right after Bear Arm Baby, was it was the biggest mistake I think that every new comic creator falls into, which is I'm gonna create my masterpiece, this big sprawling epic, and it's gonna be billions of issues long or whatever. And so I wrote this story called Grand Design with a friend Max, who he's actually an art teacher now. He's incredibly skilled. He's a great artist. We wrote this thing together and we sort of put together like half of a first issue, and I'd written like 8 scripts for it, and in a way I kind of am I'm glad that I did it that way almost, because I wrote all these scripts that nobody will ever see, and it helped me develop the the knowledge for how a script should be formatted, what things work and what don't from a lettering standpoint, how page turns work, stuff like that. Like I honestly cut my teeth just writing BS scripts that nobody will ever see. And I think that's for the best. I think people who do get their first proper script published, sometimes they're great. Sometimes they're the best comics I've ever read. I've read some great first issues or first scripts that people have written, but I think for the majority of people, they'll then sort of think that, oh man, I wish people hadn't seen this. Um, Maybe that's just me. I don't know. That could be not the general opinion, but anyway. So I wrote all these scripts and he did a lot of the art for it, but then we both sort of had to go our separate ways. And I'm still great friends with Max. We talk all the time, but we both just got way too busy. Life got in the way, and just couldn't really do it anymore. And so my my comic book career, I suppose, sort of lay dormant for several years until I got a quote unquote real job in sleep research, which I still do to this day. It's my quote unquote day job. And I was working an overnight shift, and when you're tired, you clearly should not be driving, but I had to go directly from my overnight shift to a diabetes appointment. I'm a type 1 diabetic. And I had to go to this diabetes appointment. And on my way there, I sort of half asleep imagined this world where I was sort of wondering what the results of my diabetes appointment were going to be. Like, is it going to be good news? Is it going to be bad news? Are my numbers good? Like, is my A1C too high? Like, am I going to start to lose are my nerves going to go shot when I'm 60 or whatever? And I started going down all these worst case scenarios, and then started to imagine that diabetes was this creature that sort of attached itself to me when I was 6 years old, and it's just sort of followed me everywhere. And like I've just had to deal with it because that's the only option that I have. And so I started to, in my mind, started to imagine this physical body that diabetes could take. And I remember when I was first diagnosed, I remember my mom being very upset and she was crying. And I didn't really understand why, because I didn't really understand the seriousness of diabetes. And so I had this picture in my mind of what became one of my favorite scenes in the whole series of a book that I would later write called Sweetheart, um, of my mother, um, frustrated and angry that she could not help and that there was nothing she could do to get rid of the diabetes, sort of standing in the backyard with a weapon, just like screaming at this monster to leave her son alone. Right. And it became this very emotional scene that I'm still very proud of, that I love very much. And then I sort of wrote this whole series called Sweetheart about an entire town that is plagued by monsters that latches on or chooses people and will just follow them their entire lives until it eventually kills them. And the town has sort of grown complacent. The monsters have always been there. And so the town is just sort of figured out ways to live their lives while they're being actively stalked and eaten by these monsters. And so the schools have lesson plans for the children to teach them about the monsters. The hospitals have medications to treat the injuries and to sort of try and keep the monsters at bay a little bit. Like they have repellent sort of tinctures that they can consume and put on themselves to repel the monsters for a little bit. But the monster is always there. It's always sort of hiding in the shadows, in the bathroom, under the stairs, in the bushes, wherever. Um, and so yeah, that got picked up and that got published. And yeah, that's my first, I think, properly published comic with a publisher. What ended up being Sweetheart.
I wanted to get into Sweetheart because I was looking again at your bibliography and sort of finding my way through from, Bare Arm Baby to Sweetheart and then to the new one. And that did stick out as your sort of first multi-issue series that you wrote. And it seems, quite personable, or not personable, but personal,
Yeah.
sort of this parable that has to do with your diagnosis as well. So, but I'd love to know a little bit more about the mechanics of getting to that point where you have a publisher interested. I'm sure as a writer, something we talk to indie folks about often, especially indie writers, is finding an artist, because if you're working in this medium, it's a visual medium. You can't just go out there and publish your scripts.
Yeah.
So you have to get an artist, and then oftentimes, you have to get a publisher unless you're trying to do it yourself. So can you talk a little bit about how that all came together? Maybe the writing was done, and what were your next steps? How did you find the artist? How did you get a publisher interested, involved?
Yeah, so I found the artist for Sweetheart on DeviantArt
Hmm.
when DeviantArt, back when that was a viable place for artists to, you know, sell their wares and uh and network and stuff. Um yeah, I went on DeviantArt and I just sort of searched around, looked at a bunch of different horror artists. I found Francesco Iaquinta, who became the artist for Sweetheart, and he drew the entire first issue. We worked out a page rate, and we talked every single day. We went back and forth, doing edits in the script and making sure that everything fell in line. But we wrote just the first issue, or I wrote just the first issue, and he made just the first issue. And we said, okay, this is now our business card or our flyer for this, our portfolio basically for this series. Let's go shop it around. Um, and then so we shopped it around. Marco Peñota is a good friend of Francesco because we needed a colorist, and so he jumped on board and did the coloring. Um, Seda Temofonte, who had done a bunch of work for Marvel and DC, was the letterer. I found. How did I find Seda? I think I just found her on Twitter and then went to her website and she had a contact on there and I just sort of cold emailed her and she was generous enough to take us on board. She liked the script and everything. She also made the logo for it. Um, but yeah, so these were just people that all just sort of fell in. Like it wasn't anything. I don't think super magical. I don't think it's not like we all went to a con and just met each other. Like I just sort of searched them out. Marco was sort of a blessing that Francesco had in his back pocket, and so that worked out great. But yeah, Francesco, and Seda, I just sort of reached out to, and it ended up working. And then we shopped that first issue around, and I wrote the first issue with, so I wrote the first issue with no real continuation in mind, right? I wanted it to be this crazy downer ending. I don't know if you've read the first issue, but I don't, we can spoil it. Spoilers for the first issue of Sweetheart if you haven't read it. But the first issue follows this young boy through his entire life until he's sort of in his mid 30s or 40s, and he has a wife and a child. And at the very end, the monster kills him, and then the monster's next target is his young 8-year-old daughter. And so now the implication at the end of it is now she will have to go through the same trials and tribulations that her father did. And I was talking with Seda one day at a con. I actually did go to a con with her when I was trying to shop this book around. And she was asking me all these questions. She's like, "Where's it going to go? Like, what happens? Like, what is this world?" And I just started saying stuff off the top of my head. And as I was talking, this it was all just nothing was planned. I was just saying things, and as I kept talking, I kept convincing myself. I was like, "Wow, this sounds amazing." Like, yeah, this can happen, and this can happen, and this can happen, and then most of that ended up making it into the series. and it ended up being an incredible story. I think I love every bit of that whole series. Um, then I think to get back to the original question is we we finally we just cold submitted it everywhere, and we couldn't find anybody. Nobody would pick it up. And so we wanted to make the second issue. So we put it on Kickstarter. And through Kickstarter, we got the second issue made and funded. And then we still shopped it around. We're like, hey, look, there is an interest for this book. Whether you think so or not, there is. And so we resubmitted to all these other places again. And then eventually one of them got back to us and said, yeah, we could work out a deal. We can do this. And then we made the next three issues with our publisher.
That's a fantastic story. How that all came together and how you were able to kind of persevere through what I think a lot of creatives, usually go through, which is really trying to convince other people of the value and longevity of the story and the thing you're putting together.
Yeah, I
Make
think
more issues.
I think I talked about this recently with somebody else. I think people would be there's a lot of people who get burnt out in comics very quickly because they get a load of rejections, and then they start to think that maybe their work isn't good enough, or they think they just can't keep going if no one's going to pay attention to it. But I think that people underestimate how much they can enjoy a thing when they don't take things personally. I hear a lot that they think editors or comic book publishers are just gatekeepers and they're there to push other people down. Um, and that's not true. That's objectively not true. That yes, they will reject a large number of books because the books that they publish need to be profitable. And that doesn't mean that your story isn't profitable. Your story can be better than anything DC, Marvel, or Image has ever produced. But because it doesn't fit their line, like they have an image that they need to maintain, like they have a brand, and so you may be submitting to the wrong brand, or it's or because you as an individual are not or you as a professional, I guess, are still too inexperienced, right? Writing, drawing, coloring, lettering an entire series is difficult. And it's not that they don't believe that you can do it, they just don't know if you can do it. And that's a huge risk for them to bring on someone who's never done it and expect them to do gangbusters their first time. Maybe you can. There's a good chance that you can, but they don't know that. And so there is a business behind the creative um the creative world, as beautiful and great as it is. There is a business behind it. They need to make money. And so there are editors who will very sadly say that we have to turn you away. And so if you just don't take that personally and just have faith in your story, know that what you're doing is meaningful, and then just keep doing it. And then eventually, after a while of just keeping doing it, you'll have all that experience and you'll be able to show that you can do an entire series. Um, so yeah, um, yeah, I think if as long as people just enjoy what you do despite or regardless of what anybody else believes the value of your work is. If you're enjoying it and you believe it has value, like you're gonna have a good time.
Yeah.
If a publisher sends you an email that says thank you, but we're moving on and gives you reasons, that's great. What's less great is when they just don't respond. that's kind of a bummer. But but again, yeah. So short answer is, or short, the short of it is just don't try not to take things personally and just believe in yourself, and it's gonna be great.
That's a great lesson learned. I would imagine that so many creators are so in love, so precious about their concept and their story that it's difficult to even get feedback, any feedback that is in opposition to sort of your own subjective view of
Yeah.
what you've created.
Yeah.
So I really like, a lot of those points to not take it personally.
Yeah. And to your point as well, there are a lot of team members on a comic book. And the reason for that is that there needs to be an expert in every part of the creation of it, right? They're like the person doing the line art is the best at what they do, right? Because and then the colorist is an expert in being a colorist. The editor is an expert on what things don't work in a story, right? The writer is an expert in writing and doing the story beats and things like that. And so if you create this whole thing and then somebody says that it's, that there's maybe we could tweak this little thing and make it better, like you're probably not an expert in that thing, at least not yet, right? And so if someone tells you like, oh, this dialogue could be tweaked a little bit, like some people get upset because they're too close to it and they just need to, I don't know. Anyway, don't take things personally.
So this experience, despite or maybe because of all the persistence, must have been, very gratifying and also given you kind of a full head of steam to, pursue more comic book projects of grander design, so to speak. And I wonder how and if this led to My Neighbor Necromancer. So I'd love to if you can tell us a little bit about how that comic, which again, you funded your first issue and the second issue is going to be on Kickstarter, funding soon, if not when this episode comes out. Um, how did it come about? Was the story something you had in your back pocket? Was it something that you got a kernel of an idea from somewhere else? And then how did you make that a reality given your experiences with Sweetheart?
Yeah. Um, Great question.
Probably a lot of questions in one. I'm
Yeah, I'm
infamous for doing that.
trying to organize the dozens of answers that I have in my head and see if I can make it a coherent uh reply. Um, yeah, My Neighbor Necromancer, originally when I thought of it, I believe it was around the same time that my uncle had passed very unexpectedly. And it wasn't it's not like I didn't develop the story as a direct result of that, but as time goes on I can't help but think that it certainly must have had an influence on it, because the whole book is about the human relationship with death and how complicated it is as a topic and a concept. I've always kind of thought that death is a necessary evil, I guess. But not even evil. I always kind of thought death as being sort of the great motivator. I think that if human life goes forever, that a lot of the things that humans do are motivated to defeat death, right? Caring for one another, we care for people because I think inherently we know that they're not going to be around forever. We create medicines, we create art, we create everything as a way to either sort of immortalize ourselves with our art or our writing. Um, and anyway, so I always thought death is like this very misunderstood helper. In that our nobody, and if you like death, that's a problem. So death's job is to be hated so that we can be better by trying to overcome it. And that makes death important. Um, And so the idea that I had originally, I was just in the back of a friend's car. We were going to karaoke one night, and I have no idea how it popped in there, but I had this idea that there was this young boy, and he had a pet dog that ran away, and then he finds it several days later to discover that a necromancer in the woods had killed it. And the little boy like sneaks into the house to steal a necromancy tome, and then uses the book to resurrect his dog and fight the necromancer. The necromancer ended up being a villain. But then as I started to think on it more and it started to gestate, it became more of what it is, about this young girl who discovers a friendly necromancer in the woods when she chases her pet lizard into the woods. And the necromancer himself is fighting a greater evil, um, than death itself. And so she has to sort of help the necromancer, by sort of uh, by understanding death a little bit more than just thinking of it as this horrible, terrible thing that should be banished and should be gone forever. Um, and then so I had then developed this idea for the story. I had a pitch for it, and I was recently published in an anthology book, this Christmas horror anthology called Yule, that was nominated for a Ringo. And one of the artists in one of the stories was Jason Piperberg, who is now the artist on Necromancer. And all of the people, well, most of the people in Yule got thrown into like this impromptu digital holiday party, and we all kind of met digitally and hung out and became friends. And now a lot of us still chat on a daily basis. And Jason is part of that. And so I I ended up pitching him the idea, and he immediately fell in love with it. He's like, I love everything about this. And he loved it so much that we would talk back and forth and just bat ideas back and forth. And then he ended up contributing so much to the look and the style and the tone, the feel. A lot of the ideas inherently, originated with Jason. And so he very quickly became a co-creator on the book. Um, and then I had one of the first people I ever met in comics was Luca Romano, again through DeviantArt. Before I did Sweetheart, I found Luca on DeviantArt to try and color the Grand Design book that I had made with Max, some of the pages that he'd done. And Luca did color tests for us. I think I paid him, to do a few pages that we did. And he was cool. He was great. We became friends instantly. And then when Grand Design sort of fell off everyone's radar and we sort of stopped doing it, Luca and I didn't keep in touch as much as I would have liked. And and then I saw his career start to, develop and sort of take off. I had always wished, I kept looking for projects to work on to reach out to Luca because I wanted to work with him again. And in Necromancer, My Neighbor Necromancer just ended up being the perfect fit. And so he immediately jumped on board, and that's sort of how the team came together, and sort of how we started making this book.
And you decided to go right out the gate, unless I'm mistaken, to Kickstarter yourself. Or is it a sort of play in the same way that Sweetheart was to get the, kernel of the thing going and see where you might land
Yeah,
after that?
kind of both. I'm at the point now where I, as a creator, like money's great. Everybody loves money, right? I would like to make money with my comics and my stories, but I'm kind of at a point where, as much as I love money, I want to make it. But like I'm sort of, my main motivation is for my books to get read. Like I want people to read my books. That's my main goal, my main motivation. In addition to just like being able to, writers joke that like writing is therapy. Like I can work through my own problems, including my personal relationship with death, like through this book. Um, but I want as many people to read the book as humanly possible, right? That's what I want. I want to know what people think about the book, whether it's good or bad. Like, I want to know what people think of it. I think the best way, as many there's probably more pros to self-publishing than there are cons. But one of the pros that I can't currently do about traditional publishing is reach. I can't get my book on every comic book store shelf currently. And so that's something that I would really love. I just want people to read it. And so I get to go back to the original question. I we did 6 preview pages for it to use for like a pitch portfolio for the book. We pitched it around. We heard back from almost nobody, but nobody picked it up. And instead of taking it personally and getting mad and quitting, we decided to go Kickstarter. We're like, we want to make this book no matter what happens, so let's make the book. And so we did Kickstarter. We got issue 1 going, and then once it was done and we got great feedback from people who had read it, then we used that book and we pitched it again. We sort of passed it around. I went to Comic-Con recently and I gave it to editors. I had given it to some editors before that. I had met them at Comic-Con and just I didn't go with the clear motivation as like, I'm pitching this to you, please pick it up. It was more of a, hey, I made this book. I just want to give it to you. I hope you enjoy it. Right. I had a few editors reach out to me afterward without me saying, please pick up this book. They just reached out and said, hey, this book is good. We really enjoyed this. Unfortunately, there is no place for this book at our publisher right now because the book hits a really strange middle ground, kind of in the vein of Stranger Things, where it's too adult for kids, but it's too kids for adults, right? The team and I have conversations on a daily basis about trying to strike that exact tone. And so them saying that was like, it was weirdly justifying, but also sad because that means they didn't want it. But apparently we did exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to write a kids book that didn't treat kids like kids. You know, if you think of the horror movies of our youths that people always put in like the most traumatizing kids movies of all time, right? Like Witches and Return to Oz, The Dark Crystal, stuff like that. Stuff that didn't pander to kids, but was was intended for a younger audience, and that's what we wanted. So I got feedback from editors and publishers that said this is a good book. We love it. Unfortunately, we can't do anything with it. But keep making stuff because we like it. And nobody picked it up. But and so we're sort of just continuing this journey, right? We're gonna make this book whether anybody picks it up or not. And Kickstarter is the way to do that. If somebody wants to pick us up on the way, we're more than happy to talk about it and see if we can work something out. We would love that. But until then, we're just folks making books, and we love it, and we want people to read them.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Is this intended to be a mini series?
Yeah. So right now it's planned for 6 issues. Like most people say when they're pitching a book, I'll say that there is enough of a world to expand it. There are more stories we'd love to tell. Jason and I just recently came up with a new character that we would like to hint at in this first 6 issues. And we would love to at some point actually show him off and like explain him and have him do cool stuff. But yeah, right now we're only thinking, well, we're only planning to do the first 6 issues currently.
Makes sense. So there are a number of, vividly sketched, not only in the artistic way, but characters in My Neighbor Necromancer. I wonder, do you ever or often base these characters on people you know, or are they mostly made up of whole cloth?
These are completely fabricated individuals. I trying to think if any of these individuals may have even been inspired by specific people. Um, yeah, I don't think so. No, yeah, I think these are all whole cloth, unique individuals. That's probably a better question for Jason, whether his design, his physical design, he based on anybody. Um, there's got to be somebody that we kind of based him off. I don't think there is though. Normally, every time I like have ideas for a character design, I'll have like a celebrity or a character in a movie. Like we kind of want this vibe.
Hmm.
Uh, but okay, I guess Gandalf, I guess, maybe counts for
For the
Cyrano.
benevolent, yeah,
Yeah. So
one.
he's this benevolent, sort of lighthearted, can be very serious when he needs to be, but is in the most part just sort of a yeah, like a joyous person and sort of a goofball from time to time. But other than that, I think other than the personality of Cyrano being loosely based on Gandalf, I'm not sure that any of them were directly inspired by anybody specific, at least that I can think of at the moment. Maybe
Yeah,
for
yeah. I was wondering, family, friends, do they enter into this at all?
yeah.
The character of Jesse, you have a niece, do you have, somebody that's
I mean, I do have a lot of nieces and nephews. I will say, sorry, all my nieces and nephews, but the Jesse was not directly inspired, I think, by any of you.
right. So I can't help but notice in your background the Jason mask and Freddy glove, and we've
Yeah.
talked a number of times. Yep. That horror seems to be a big motivator and informative part of your work.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know, what your experience was like growing up. Like where did the love for horror come from?
My love for horror started with very very loose parenting rules. I had very questionable parenting. I don't believe that, but I think other people would view it that way. I started watching horror movies since I can remember. I think my favorite movie when I was 4 or 5 years old was Jaws. People can get in a tizzy about whether Jaws is a horror movie or a thriller movie or what have you, but come on, it's a horror movie. And my dad would be watching football on TV in the living room, and I would come into the living room and just like put Jaws in the VCR. He'd be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" I was like, he's like, "I'm watching football." And then my line that he still quotes to this day is "Maybe later, Dad." And then I would stick in Jaws and then go sit with him on the couch and watch Jaws, and he would miss his football game. From there, like I think I snuck into my brother's room when he was watching Leprechaun. Um,
Hmm.
for the first time. And I remember watching it like crouched outside the door and just being mesmerized by this gruesome not for kids movie. And then and then yeah, and then I went to the the movies the rental store. I'm trying to remember the word. You ever mess up like forget archaic words now? Like
All the
VCR
time.
VCR some time ago, I was like, yeah, the movie
The
player,
tape
like
machine.
the cassette player. Yeah, like no, it's a VCR. But the rental store, in the I went there and I walked into the horror aisle, and there were just two long aisles just completely decorated with the worst horror movies you could imagine at the time, and I was like, I want to see every single one of these. And I started alphabetically. I can't remember what the first one was. It was probably something with a number in it. Um,
Yeah.
or
I'm trying to get it to
yeah,
A, although it
yeah,
may have been like a number
yeah. So
that
it,
comes
it
before A.
might have been a number, uh, but for some reason, the first one that comes to mind is Amityville Horror. but
Yeah,
there's got to be other
that's a good
ones.
one. What popped into my head was Anaconda. I'm like, that's not a horror movie, you dope.
I mean, and it's a horror
But
movie kind of in the same way that Jaws is. I'm not
yeah,
sure, but I mean,
yeah.
to everyone's point who says that Jaws is not a horror movie, I guess I don't know that I've ever seen Jaws in the horror section, much like Anaconda, that was always in a different area. But
Hmm.
movie stores are wrong. That's why they went out of business. You heard it here first. The
This,
reason
here's the
video
real
rental
story.
stores, yeah, went out of business is because they refused to classify Jaws and Anaconda correctly.
I always knew it was going to be something we didn't suspect.
So yeah, so I grabbed whichever video it was, and I asked my mom if I could get it, and she was like, "All right," and we got it, and then I watched it, and then we went to the video store to return it, and I grabbed the next one, and I just throughout the next several years of my life, because new ones would come out, and I would have to make exceptions and watch those ones first, and I just kept watching, and then um, yeah, the rest was sort of history. I became that weird kid in high school, middle school and high school who was obsessed with horror movies. Um, and that sort of became a defining part of my personality was my love for horror. And I think I've got all sorts of philosophical spinnings I can put on why I think horror is the best and why I think horror can maybe be suited for children and why there are benefits to kids maybe watching horror sometimes, but we can get into that maybe some other time. But so yeah, so I think that's where it all kind of started and it just became ingrained in my DNA.
We'll save the kids in horror for the sequel.
Yeah.
Give everybody just a little
Yeah.
taste of what's to come.
Right.
Um, That's great. I'd love to know as we're, coming to a close. You seem to be digging, and have a well of your own ideas and your original work. But if someone, a grant wisher came out of the woodwork and said you can work on a pre-existing comic property, maybe you've daydreamed about this. What would that be?
Oh my gosh.
You have any stories ready to go for any characters or
I
properties?
have I'm gonna do a horror one. But I will say that I've got what I think is the coolest idea for an X-Men Cyclops story that I've never seen, and I don't think they've ever talked about in the comics. It's like an integral part of who Cyclops is, and like nobody ever talks about it, and I don't think it's ever been really fully addressed in the comics. Marvel, you can email me if you're interested. Um, yeah, so I am a an avid fan of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. And I don't know if you've been on Kickstarter recently, but there is a huge campaign right now for a Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver prequel comic that's doing gangbusters right now. And on one hand, I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. And on the other hand, I'm like, I'm really mad that I'm not involved in this. Um, and I'll to be fully honest, as familiar as I am with the lore of Soul Reaver, I didn't have a ready to go story for it, and so maybe it's for the best. Um, the another what was the other one? The horror one that I really wanted to do was so there's a video game called Hunt Showdown. And I've been obsessed with this video game since it hit consoles, I think in early 2020. I've got way too many hours, literally thousands of hours in this game. Partially because during lockdown, like people played video games like it was their life. Like people weren't working, they were just playing video games. At least I was. Um, and it's about a zombie outbreak, like you do, but it's in like the 1800s Louisiana swamp, and there are like king monsters, boss monsters, and you have to kill this boss, grab the bounty token from it, and then escape without other hunters finding and killing you. And so it's this big multiplayer PvP VE game. But the lore for it is so incredibly deep, and I really want to write a comic for Hunt Showdown. I've added them a few times and then realized that that's kind of a scumbag thing to do a lot of the time on Twitter. And so I stopped adding them, and now I'm just sort of silently hoping that one day they'll do an open call for for comic writers to do a Hunt Showdown adaptation comic.
All right. We got to
Yeah.
get this episode out
Yeah, let's do it.
right into the right ears.
Call me
Uh,
Crytek.
So, I think I know the answer to this next question, which is, what's next? I imagine it's issue 3,
Yeah.
after, what we hope and I know will be a successful Kickstarter for issue 2. Anything else, any other irons in the fire that you could talk about? A lot of times, they're either so early or, whatever you can't talk about, but
Yeah, there are 2 ideas that I'm very interested to get made. They're both shorts. And so they I think are probably most appropriate for like an anthology, or maybe I would just have to make them off of my own um out of my own wallet and just pay to have them made just for the sake of getting them made because I'm really excited about them. Um and then the other one I can't talk about. I guess of the two short ones that I want to get made, one of them is a story about when I was a kid, again, another personal story. When I was a child, do you know those big metal structures that hold power lines? You usually see them like out in the country, out in the fields, these big monstrous metal contraptions that hold the power lines.
yeah, yeah.
When I was a child, there were 2 different versions of them that were right next to each other, not near our house, but on our drive to somewhere else. And one of them kind of vaguely had a traditionally female type form, and another one had what would be considered maybe a traditionally male type form. And my brother convinced me that there was a witch that those frozen things were the children of giants and that they were out picking flowers for their mom, and an evil witch froze them there. And so they were just frozen in time. And so I wrote a comic about it, and it is rad. And I really want to get it made. It's like 6 pages long. And so it's a nice short thing that I could easily post around and just get people to look at. And so I really want to get that made. And that's, I suppose I'll end it there, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, all that sounds cool.
Yeah. I'm
I
excited.
even the mystery project they can't talk about. So
Yeah.
we
The
look
mystery
forward to.
project is one of those things that's it's so early in the development that I don't know if it's gonna happen, but if it does happen, it will be something that I'm not allowed to talk about.
We'll shake
Anyway,
the earth.
yeah, I hate to be cryptic and weird like that, but anyway.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dillon. I like his perseverance. I like his outlook on how to get into and break into comics and really persevere and do great work and find your niche. And then give the audience what they want. And I think he's doing that with My Neighbor Necromancer. We hope you all go out and back the second issue and on and on. But thank you, Dillon, for being on the program. Before we close out, I also, like Oren has been doing, want to shout out CBC Awards. So go to cbcawards.org, go to vote. We're in the first within the first few categories of the 1 through 99 subscribers on YouTube, even though we now have surpassed 1,000. So thank you everybody out there for doing that. cbcawards.org. Please vote for the Dollar Bin Bandits. We appreciate it and help support the show. What else can you do? You can rate, you can review, you can subscribe on YouTube. You can go to Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We would appreciate that. And it really just shows support for the show. And we want to keep bringing you the show. So go do it. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this week's episodes. We'll be back next week with, I believe, another 3-episode week. So we'll see you then. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you next issue.